Good morning everyone and welcome to the Equal Opportunity Committee's 13th meeting of 2013. Can I remind everyone to set any electronic devices to either flight mode or switch them completely off. I'd like to start this morning with introductions. At the table we have our clerking and research team together with official reporters, and around the room we are supported by Broadcasting Services and the Security Office. And can I also welcome the observers in the public gallery. My name is Mary Fee and I'm the committee's convener. Can I now invite members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting on my right?
I am Marco Biaggi. I'm the MSP for Edinburgh Central and the deputy convener of the committee.
Good morning, I'm Dennis Robertson, MSP for Aberdeenshire West.
Alec Johnston, MSP for North East Scotland.
Good morning, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
It's Siobhan McMahon, MSP for Central Scotland.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
I'm Jill Wood, Policy Analyst with Engender.
I'm Emma Rich, Project Manager with Close the Gap.
I'm Lynn McDowell, Professional Officer for the Royal College of Nursing.
I'm Gab McGregor, Head of HR and Organisational Development at North Ayrshire Council.
I'm Eileen Dinning, Equalities Officer, Unison Scotland.
Thank you for that. The only agenda item today is an evidence session on women in work with a focus on flexible working. Committee members have a number of questions for our panel of witnesses this morning, and I'm going to start with Dennis Robertson, who's going to ask some questions around home working, and then move to Marco Biaggi with questions around the cultural presumptions on part-time working. Dennis.
Thank you, Convener. With regard to home working, there's been an increase in the number of people maybe having the opportunity to do some home working. What are the barriers to home working at the moment, as far as you can see, and what are some of the advantages and opportunities, especially for women, regarding home working? Start with anyone, basically.
Yes, Ms. Wood.
I could maybe kick off anecdotally because I get to work from home in my position as Policy Analyst at Engender. Now, we're not the NHS or providing frontline services. We're an NGO which conducts policy analysis, and so obviously that plays into enabling that, but other colleagues also get to work remotely, as well as other forms of flexible working, term time working, part-time working, to fit around our needs. And what I can see very strongly from that is that it definitely boosts morale, psychological well-being, as well as efficiency and loyalty to the organisation. So just a sort of anecdotal point to start with.
Do you think that with that flexibility that you have, that it enables things like childcare to be obviously catered for in a much wider context as well?
That's certainly the case with my colleagues who are term time workers. They can fit their hours around school hours, childcare, and whatever those needs are. And my colleague is also caring for a disabled son, and so she has very specific needs, and she wouldn't be able to do this job at all if it wasn't for Engender's flexible working policies.
Do you feel that the employers in general are comfortable at looking at perhaps providing opportunities for more people to homework?
I think that there's a sort of lack of knowledge is one of the main barriers, and certainly sort of anecdotally through the STUC, actually the Women's Employment Summit, I was quite struck by an intervention about just assumptions around lack of career prospects going forward, and assumptions around people being afraid to ask for those opportunities and afraid to put in requests for flexible working due to the sort of stigmas around it.
And then Gavin McGregor.
I think that some employers are still very wary about the idea of home working, and I think it was quite unhelpful to have Marissa Mayer, the new chief executive of Yahoo, weighing in by saying that one of the first staffing decisions she was making was to remove home working completely from the employees at Yahoo. I think there are some other barriers to working from home. One of those is a lack of management confidence, that if there is not line of sight scrutiny over what employees are doing, then it will be very difficult to manage the delivery of tasks. There are a number of organisations who've surmounted those barriers and discovered that actually placing trust in employees is rewarded with increased productivity. And British Telecom is a success story. They have quite a number of home working call centre operatives, and they've reduced reduced absenteeism by 20% and increased productivity in the workers who use those patterns. But there are also issues with procurement, and I was talking to an HR director at a non-departmental public body recently, and he was saying he would love to enable more colleagues to work from home, but the way they had procured their IT systems meant that the system that recorded all the information that was necessary for the delivery of their business was such that you couldn't access it remotely, and it was impossible to make it secure on that basis. However, had they considered flexible working and home working when they procured that system, then a different system might have been bought. I think the benefits for women are, as Jill set out, that because women have a greater level of responsibility for caring for children, for sick people, for older people, that home working offers flexibility. Obviously, you can't sit at home doing your job while simultaneously caring for a toddler, but what it would enable you to do is select perhaps nursery provision near to your home, so that you're not then having to deal with the very difficult challenge of taking a child to a nursery facility and then going on to your place of employment, potentially in a workplace that doesn't offer a flexible start time.
I think flexible or agile working is really a key priority for our organisation. And in terms of barriers, I would agree with Emma. I think the technology's there, we have policy and procedures, but I think a lot of it is about cultural barriers. I was quite interested in the CIPD report last month that picked up on that, and it really said it's about line manager attitudes towards flexible working. So I think it does require a shift in organisational culture away from sort of outcome towards outcomes and trust working, whereas a lot of managers are more traditionally used to sort of having people there, managing the presence and having that control on people. So,
of line managers, supervisors, that.
I think it varies. I think it does vary. I think one thing that does really help is sort of senior management role modelling. In our organisation, 11 of our 16 most senior managers are female. And I think breaking down these sort of barriers by their role modelling can have a significant effect when people see that, and it sort of cascades.
Anyone else want to answer the question?
Just a couple of points, because if it backs up what Emma was saying, that we still have a serious cultural problem in terms of employers' attitude, and it's that, direct line, why are they not here? And so that has to be addressed. I think a big problem with the flexible work regulations, which I've put in our submission, is that there's actually so many opt-outs for employers that it becomes extremely difficult, particularly for women, to find the option that actually suits them. The other point I would make is that we should not see it as a substitute for childcare. We need to reinforce our view that childcare has to be part of a societal responsibility and not just left solely to women to deal with. I think that where that there could be advantages to homework, provided that there was appropriate health and safety and other factors taken into account, is for women that live in rural areas, particularly where there have been, big cuts in childcare services and the obvious problems that go along with working, or certainly remote working in areas like that. So it's about how we get, it's only part of a balanced programme of flexible working.
I'm interested in, obviously, rural and remote, given my own constituency, and one of the barriers is obviously, connectivity in itself, which is obviously a barrier to in preventing people home working. But my thoughts basically are, if the connectivity is there and the opportunities exist, and I take your point, it's no substitute for childcare. I'm not suggesting for one moment it is, but it does provide a higher degree of flexibility around the working day. And even if children are going to bed at a reasonable time, even during the daytime, so it does allow a great deal. We heard from the Law Society last week, for instance, that if people haven't finished what they're doing, basically in the office, they've got the opportunity to take maybe laptops home and work, maybe a couple of hours in the evening sometimes. So there's a great deal of flexibility around, and I'm really just trying to pursue the fact that, does home working in itself, if we can get round some of the cultural and maybe some of the fear aspects or the maybe lack of trust, is it, from middle management, I would think. Is it an opportunity to try and ensure that more women get the opportunity to be in work with that degree of flexibility?
I guess I would certainly agree with that, but it has to be just one of a number of options that that's available. And I think the other point that I wanted to make was that you cannot underestimate the importance of also having that social and personal connection with your work colleagues, so that you don't always have that that remoteness of working solely from home all the time. So, but you're absolutely right.
You're
I mean, it's
promoting
about
a sort of mix and match approach in terms of office-based plus flexibility for home working and I mean, I think that happens with a lot.
I think also recognition that probably not all jobs would be suitable for home working.
I mean, you can't homework if you're working at Tesco's checkout, for instance.
We don't know.
To name one.
The future holds.
There's a lot more. Of course, a lot more people are doing online shopping, of course. But there you go. No, I think that's fine. Thank you very much. Thanks.
I'll move to Marco Biagi now to ask questions around cultural attitudes, and then move on to John Mason, who wants to talk about part-time working in schools. Marco.
Perhaps I could, as a starter, just ask you as a panel, do you think there is a cultural problem with how we perceive part-time work in our society in terms of its value? And anybody who wants to start, go right ahead.
I think predominantly for nurses, part-time working features quite highly because of the workforce in the NHS is 89% of nursing workforce is women. And part-time working is very important to work around a number of issues. Health issues, for instance. If nursing is a very, very heavy job and people can work if they can work part-time. The cultural issues around it are very difficult to overcome. It is much easier to employ people on a whole-time basis than it is part-time. It's harder to work in rosters for part-time workers. It's harder to arrange in-house training. A number of issues prevent, particularly in the independent sector, they would much prefer people working full-time rather than part-time, and it's sometimes quite a battle to get overcome that.
Maybe come back on that for a particular experience from nursing, because very often the statistics are quoted that women are more likely to be in part-time work than men, but also that some of the women are also more likely to be in certain professions than men, and it's hard to disentangle that. So in nursing, is a female nurse just as likely to be a part-time nurse as a male nurse, or is it that in nursing female nurses are more likely to be part-time than their male equivalents?
Well, there is a shift on that now, because within nursing, nurses marry nurses, and we quite often have job shares with partners working in the organisation. It's a very big organisation. But I think predominantly you would find that most part-time workers in the NHS just now are women.
And is there any difficulty when it comes to promotion in the NHS? If you're seeking career advancement for somebody who is part-time, do they not appear as attractive as somebody who's been whole-time?
Absolutely. I think you'd find it as rare as hen's teeth to see a part-time charge nurse, clinical manager, or anybody further up the line. Part-time usually means staff nurse grade, and it'd be very difficult to get promotion unless you were going to work full-time.
If you have been working part-time and you seek promotion, does that go against you, even if you're willing to then switch to full-time? Or is that...
paper you would say no,
right.
But you would ask in relation to that, employer would look at, well, you've been working part-time, why have you been working part-time, what would it mean working full-time? That's a big shift, and I think that on paper would go against somebody seeking promotion. They would more likely move into full-time employment and then seek promotion.
And do other panel members have views? Go ahead.
I
I could pick up on the Fawcett Society report. There was a piece in Scotsman yesterday about the fact that that there are higher rates of unemployment amongst women now than there have been for about a quarter of a century. And certainly a lot of research that the STUC has done over the past couple of years is showing that while the situation in Scotland is probably marginally better, the problem is that when you talk about jobs, increasingly the amount of jobs that we're now seeing are part-time jobs. And what you cannot discount either is increasingly the number of women that are now being employed on zero-hour contracts. And so certainly, not just with my Unison hat on, but also from an STUC perspective, we have serious concerns about what we see as increasing casualisation of the workforce, and the bulk of that workforce are women. What we're also concerned about is the number of public sector contracts that are moving into the private sector, and where a lot of these employers are employing people, particularly women, or on part-time, on zero-hour contracts. And there's been quite a significant increase, and that is backed up by UK government figures over the past year.
Can I just pick up on the point that you made about zero-hour contracts? And I know if I put in my previous life with my previous hat on in the retail sector, zero-hour contracts were becoming something that was being increasingly used across the sector. Would you say that zero-hour contracts are the employer's option to an application for flexible working? That's their view of flexible working. I'll give you a 0 hours contract, and the flexibility is the employers, not the employees. No?
I mean, flexible work is not about, if I could use the word, exploitation. And frankly, that's what I think zero-hour contracts are about, is about exploitation. And I think they see women as a cheap option. So no, I don't accept that at all. That if you're on whatever type of flexible work that you're on, you should have a proper contract of employment. You should be paid, we believe, a living wage. But you should also have the other opportunities that go along with that, including progression in terms of promotion and training and everything that goes along with that.
One question before I bring you in, because I was interested in the briefing from Unison when you talk about zero-hour contracts amongst home carers, and home carers are predominantly women. It's mostly women. Quite often they work antisocial, lots of different hours. Are zero-hours contracts something that home care workers want, or is that something that they are offered?
No. I mean, if you are given a proper contract of employment, there are a lot of protections that go along with that. I don't have as much evidence as I could, and I would be more than happy to submit further evidence to the committee, specifically around home care issues, because I have a colleague that's actually doing a lot of work around that at the moment. But certainly what we're finding is that they're not paying, well, part of the problem is they're being told that they can only spend so much time with clients, and that's very difficult for them because they don't know what kind of cases they're going to be dealing with. There's the emotional impact that potentially has on them as a carer as well, albeit a professional carer. But the other problem is that they're not getting paid when they move from one client to another. And certainly, as a trade union, when they were working, certainly within local authorities, they had that protection. You know, so, I mean, and also, but we need to remember that if you're getting paid by the hour, even if that's national minimum wage that you're getting paid, it's barely enough for people to live on, you know. And it means that they're increasingly having to work more and more hours in order just to get a basic living wage. And, I mean, that cannot be good for anybody. It's certainly not good for the economy. And I think that there is also potential problems, particularly for the very vulnerable clientele that these people are being paid to look after.
Dennis, do you have a supplementary?
Just on the zero-hour contracts, if I may, do we know, sort of percentage-wise, how many people in zero-hour contracts are actually working full-time equivalents as to part-time working? And do you see zero-hour contracts as just a total lack of commitment from employers?
I don't have those figures on me, Mr Robertson. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
See the zero-hour contracts as a total lack of commitment from employers?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Of within the NHS, we've been very much against zero-hour contracts because it's been cost-cutting rather than filling substantive posts. There's predictability about, for instance, A&E departments. We know how many people are going to come into A&E departments. We don't need people on zero-hour contracts to plug the gaps. There are other alternatives. There is flexible working. There's also the use of bank staff. It's another option for flexible working. 0 hours contracts are a cop-out, and I just support what Eileen has said on that. They're not an option for flexible working.
So, since we're still on 0 hours contracts, I take it the idea of a 0 hours contract in a promoted position is patently ridiculous and would never happen because it's only the frontline workers that get that kind of treatment. Is that the case?
Well, certainly what we're finding within Unison that it was the Office of National Statistics that came out with the report, and what they had looked at specifically was the way in which public sector contracts were being handed to private sector figures, and that throughout the United Kingdom, I think it was, there was now over 200,000 people that were on these contracts, and 52% of them were women. So, it's an increasing problem. It's a big, big problem. I don't know if that answers your question specifically.
Do the other panel members want to come in on perhaps the initial subject of the status of part-time work?
Yeah, I mean, your initial comment was about cultural assumptions around part-time work, and I don't quite know where to start on that because it really cuts right to the nub of everything that Engender is an organisation working on systemic gender inequality issues and anti-sexist discrimination. It's basically all about that for us, and the fact that part-time work to some extent exists so that women can accommodate their unpaid caring responsibilities that props up the so-called real economy. And Emma will be able to talk expertly to the specifics about the pay gap that goes along with that, and probably a lot more about the horizontal occupational segregation that we see as a result. But yes, basically the short answer to your question about are there cultural assumptions around part-time work?
And are there ways you could suggest to address that?
Well, I mean, already I think the big one that people immediately point to is childcare and a sort of costed or plan. There's been a lot of, the Scottish Government's made a lot of references to childcare as infrastructure and the need to move towards some of the Scandinavian models that we know then relieve the pressure to provide flexible working or part-time working at low rates. And so I think we see that as a sort of one of those, a sort of underpinning issue which would address a lot of it.
So is your view then that the best way of dealing with the issue of part-time working is to enable women to work full-time rather than, or as the first battle to fight is to enable more women to work full-time?
Providing, loosening up the suite of options that people have and the access that they have to paid work and on what terms. So additionally, and again, Emma can speak much more expertly to this, but a strategy to tackle horizontal occupational segregation would need to be joined up across these policy areas. They don't exist in isolation of one another. And it goes back to what Eileen said at the beginning there about, well, yes, we want to see more home options for home working, but it has to come alongside other options. And I'd go as far as to say that it has to come as a joint up package, a strategy that is a suite of options rather than just in isolation of one another. So I see it as
so in terms of bringing up the status of part-time working, because if that remains a suite of options, I mean, I don't necessarily expect an answer to this because it is a difficult question. If it was an easy answer, somebody would have done it already. But if that's going to be in the suite of options, how do we deal with the status problem in there? Is that something that's yet to be answered?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's part of the sort of, as you say, the cultural undervaluation of these female-dominated sectors, and that just comes down to, as I said, the sort of the core issue of a society, as an economy, our politics. We don't value women's unpaid work or the social reproductive economies. One thing that I'm sort of cribbing again from Close the Gap, but a strategy which ties in all sorts of stakeholders, including career advisors and the education system, and basically a national action plan, more or less, to tackle the undervaluation and occupational segregation.
I think there's also some immediate things that could be done at the workplace level, and certainly when we go out to speak to employers and work with them on issues in their workforces, we see an enormous amount of cultural hostility to the idea of part-time working. So part-time working is an accommodation, an arrangement you might make with an individual to retain them, or it's something that happens within the typing pool because women need to go off and do reproductive and domestic labour. So often the idea of having a senior person working on a part-time basis is very much not part of the grain of how things go. And there is a lack of management confidence, I think, even in how you might go about recruiting someone on a part-time basis, how you would manage a team of people who are all working on part-time basis, and whether or not that would deliver the coverage to your clients or customers or the recipients of your services in the public sector. And so I think there does need to be an increase in people's understanding that actually having a whole team of people working on a part-time basis does not necessarily have any negative impact on your services or your clients. And there are some really good examples of organisations and companies in the private sector who've managed to make part-time working work even in organisational and industrial sectors where there is a presumption against that. So even in commercial legal services, there are law firms who operate a very flexible working arrangements and have a number of part-time workers, don't have people available at all hours to clients, and are still delivering a high quality service. So I think there are perhaps some good examples that other organisations could learn a great deal from.
Yeah. You on that.
Yes.
It's always good to have positive examples to highlight,
yes,
because often we're searching around for them.
Sure.
Could you suggest some? I mean, you said there are law firms.
Yes,
are there any other services or
yes, there
sectors?
are, and there are even companies working in sectors like manufacturing who've managed to make flexibility work extremely well for them in terms of delivering their business. The Equality and Human Rights Commission in 2010 produced guidance for managers on how to deal with the issue of flexible working, including part-time working, and they have a whole range of case studies with all the different kinds of employers I've mentioned. So I'd be very happy to send that to the clerk for circulation to you. It's quite short and very accessible, but I think something that many employers find quite useful to know how others have succeeded. And
clearly deserve recognition as well.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, I think there's a bit of a difference between the public and private sectors as well, and it's something in local government and the rest of the public sector we've started to get better at. And I think I would agree with it's having the options. I think it's not just about part-time working, it's having various options such as term time working, compressed hours, so we can find the balance that meets the service needs, but obviously meets the work-life balance needs of employees. So having that suite of options, I think, is really important. But also, it's not just having them; it's making it happen. And I think sort of senior management modelling is really important around that. I think that is a key issue. If it's just there as a policy, but actually people don't take it up or are scared to take it up, then it's about actually implementing it and making it happen. It's important.
But can I just say that, that while I agree with everything that Emma has said there, we have to ensure that we're not seeing this increase in part-time work as a substitute for full-time employment. The second point that I would make is that define what you mean by part-time. I mean, I know that I think that part-time's maybe about 16 to 20 hours a week. There are employers out there that think 32 to 35 hours a week is part-time work and will pay part-time wages accordingly. So I think we need to be careful about how we get that balance and ensure that if people are being offered and want the option of part-time work, either as a permanent deal or maybe something that they can change in the future, that it's under the protection of employment rights legislation and other relevant legislation.
Siobhan McMahon, do you have a supplementary on that?
Yeah, it was just, as we talk about legislation, for that, in a few of your submissions, you talked about the right to ask for flexible working patterns rather than the right to have it granted. Do you think that legislation is the key to that? Do you think it would be helpful or not? Because some of the suggestions of flexible working took me by surprise. For instance, the RCN said swapping hours was a flexible working practice, where I wouldn't necessarily have thought that to be the case before. So do you think that would help? Because in particular, the examples that the RCN gave, particularly the first one of the district nurse who worked part-time and required some additional help and had asked for that and it was declined, I think that would have surprised a lot of us. So again, do you think that legislation would be the answer to that particular problem?
Absolutely. It is defined as the right to ask for flexible working, and that example that was given sadly is a real example, and it wasn't an onerous request. It was an issue around having to work alternate weekends. None of that is impossible to overcome, but it is the culture and the right of the employer to say no, and rather than try and work around some of these sometimes quite simple options, they just choose to say no. And one of the other examples we gave was of a nurse sort of in her latter years of employment, having been employed for 30 odd years with the same employer, asked to reduce her hours working up to retirement. And again, that was declined. Now, that's not an unreasonable request, and it is not unsurmountable in relation to how that could be overcome. As a charge nurse of many years ago, I would have been able to work around that, and I can't see why these requests can't be met on quite a simple basis. So legislation would help.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I do think that the existing UK legislation really does need an overhaul, and I think we said that, and I've been saying that for a long time, is that there's just way too many opt-outs for employers to refuse requests. I mean, there's been a huge improvement insofar as a lot of women are now being given the kind of flexible working that they want, but there's still far too many being rejected for requests, and the implications for them, you know, not just in terms of, you know, their salary, but childcare responsibilities can be absolutely massive. So either they overhaul the existing regulations or they beef them up so that it does make it more difficult. You legislate because the voluntary approach isn't working.
Move to John Mason with some questions around part-time working, and then John Finney, who I think has more questions around flexible working and the right to apply. John?
Yes, I think really to carry on from where we've been going, and just, I mean, I'm interested in definitions of flexibility, and I mean, definitions of part-time's already been raised, but I mean, we have a very upbeat paper, I think, from North Ayrshire Council, and one of the issues I see, it says currently 5% of managers and 22% of teachers have moved to flexible working hours arrangements, which sounds quite positive. But we had the EIS as well, and they were saying that in education there are in practice only two models of flexible working that can be used: permanent job share or permanent part-time work. And these models act as an immediate disadvantage to women. In essence, the predominant issue is not to do with the availability of flexible working practices, which is a byproduct of teacher workforce reorganisation, but a lack of full-time permanent contracts with a degree of real flexibility built in. And I just wonder then, is flexibility being a word that's being used in different ways? I mean, flexibility, it would appear, on the one hand, means anything that's not a normal full-time contract, but flexibility for most of our minds means that actually next week you could kind of play around with the hours you were doing.
Yeah, in that instance that you do the figures there, that does relate to part-time working. I think the wording of that does suggest that it's wider than that, but right across the whole of our council workforce, I think we only have about 48% of our female employees that have a full-time contract. So we do have, although teaching is part-time, full-time, we have just a wide array of different arrangements, as I say, across term time, compressed, part-time, right across the span of that. Agile working again is a key part of that. So it's something as a council that we really see as a key priority. We've got it in our Equalities Action Plan this year as one of our key areas that we're trying to push on, because not only do we are our workforce asking for it, but we think there's a lot of business organisational benefits to it. So it is something that we want to really support wherever we can as a win-win. I think looking at our applications, I look back over for various forms of flexible working, our default and our default from our chief executive is wherever operationally possible, we go with the employees' flexible working requests, and I think we have something like 90% of them are approved. So it's something that we are trying to encourage.
And would you, as a council, if we stick with teachers, would you, as a council, have the ability to give a bit more flexibility if you wanted to, or is that all nationally decided?
I think it's more on a national basis. I mean, as I say, it's based on the service needs, and teaching obviously comes with constraints around that. But as I say, our default is to be operationally flexible, but teachers is a more of a different situation, I would suggest.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, from the head teacher's point of view, it's tidier if one person's in every morning and one person's in every afternoon. If it's a job share or something like that, I don't know in practice if there is flexibility for the individual head teacher or for the staff. Can they switch around between themselves or in these areas? Is there much flexibility?
To be honest with you, I don't know at that level what sort of flexibility. I would imagine there's informal and formal. Some of the things that we would see is about the contractual changes, but you do hear say that there are more informal arrangements on the ground, but I couldn't definitively give you all those.
Can I ask the others then, the word flexibility, is that being interpreted in different ways in different places?
Hard to say. I think mainly because a lot of the cases that maybe come my way from other colleagues, because I work full-time for Unison, is that women have been denied the request under the legislation. But I do think that it's, again, that there's a cultural problem. You know, there's a mindset there that I think a lot of the time it's about, I don't think I'll be able to manage this. This is going to cause me lots and lots of problems. When in fact, I suspect Gavin would probably back me and others up by saying that where people get the flexibility that they need, and Unison as an organisation, as an employer actually, has introduced this flexible work policy, and it's no longer just about job sharing. So, for example, a colleague of mine who had, along with her family, had responsibility for looking after a mum who had dementia for quite a long period. So they were almost like doing this in shifts. And she had the option of starting work at 7:30 in the morning and leaving at 2:30 in the afternoon. And it was a perfect arrangement for her. Now, that wasn't going to be a permanent arrangement. It would have been if she'd wanted it. Because I think she's now kind of moved back to, different hours again. But I think that's the kind of flexibility that I'm thinking about, if that makes sense. So that where you have a specific set of circumstances, and she was then able to reorganise and remanage her life as a result of, we might not want to start work at 7:30 in the morning. I know you probably do as MSPs, but from 7:30 to 2:30, this was perfect, And then when the worst part of that situation was over, she was able to move back to starting about 8:30, again. So that's where I'm coming from. It's what suits people best. And I don't see any reason why employers can't be a wee bit more imaginative about going along with that. Even to the extent of, if it's something difficult, let's pilot it. Let's see what the problems are, what are the pros, what are the cons, and then learn from that process.
I think flexibility doesn't necessarily mean part-time. If I have a 37.5-hour contract, which is classed as full-time, then there are a number of options of how I fulfil that. But if I happen to work in an area that works 12.5-hour shifts and I only want to work a core shift of 9 till 5, then you would hope that that would be accommodated. A lot of areas work 12.5-hour shifts. That's quite a big ask for somebody who maybe has childcare starting at 7 in the morning and working till 7 at night, particularly if it's a very heavy care of the elderly ward. Whereas if I was working maybe these hours over more days, less hours, then that's completely doable. I'm not saying that it is for managers, because they'd prefer to have people all working the same kind of shifts because it's easier to roster and it's easier to cover the service. But these options, they are available, and we do have some really good areas of good practice with people self-rostering to cover the service, but there's still a number of areas that are not flexible enough at looking at shift patterns. And if they did think out the box sometimes, there's a big push within the NHS to reduce sickness absence. They would reduce sickness absence by doing that, because people would be less inclined to go off sick because they were so tired by the influx of the 12.5-hour shifts. They would also be less inclined to take carers leave, which is another onerous burden on managers to give carers leave because of needs of children or care of the elderly or whatever. But sometimes it's just trying to get them to think out the box and see what the benefits to them would be, but not necessarily part-time.
Going to change over time? That's just a question of time till people's thinking changes?
I think it's a full-time job for us to try and persuade people to do that, but I think there needs to be a cultural shift in looking. Flexible working just now is looked on as some kind of luxury. I'll give you it if I can, but it needs to be. Nursing is an ageing workforce. There's also a dire need for lots of vacancies, lots of areas that are not covered adequately, and if there was more flexible working patterns, people would be more inclined to come back to work, and that's the culture we need to change.
I think we're slightly in the danger zone in terms of employers' assessment of their own flexibility, in that over 95% of employers in the public sector have some kind of, they think, flexible working arrangement, and it's 66% in the private sector. But actually how well that has translated into real flexibility for real people is not very well. And so I think that, yes, employers do feel they're flexible, and it's good that there is a range of options that are included under the rubric of flexibility, whether that's a formal flexi-time system, perhaps part-time working, although I'm slightly uneasy that that's seen as flexible in some ways. Whatever the system is, there should be something which fits all kinds of employers and can be adapted to the needs of the business. But I think actually we are seeing a big gap between the policies that employers have introduced, very welcome though they are, and the practice that is operating inside many organisations. And something we were very struck by, we did a piece of work with the STUC Women's Committee looking at a whole range of different employment practice that was operating in local authorities. And we were very struck by the small number of local authorities who seemed to be actually gathering data on flexible working at all. And we were particularly concerned about this because anecdotally, in going out to employers during the recession and recovery period, we've been hearing stories of flexible arrangements that are informal being withdrawn under the pressure of work, because reducing budgets have meant obviously that there are perhaps a smaller number of people in some teams, whether in private sector companies or in public organisations, left to do the work that is now available. And so we're very concerned that this time of economic economic downturn and recovery is going to have quite a profound impact on flexibility and on people's ability to manage flexibility, which is seen as as Lynn said, a kind of luxury that you can make in good times, but perhaps isn't something for down times.
Do you have any more questions, John?
Other subjects, but maybe come back to them later.
Okay, yep. Can I bring in John Finney now?
Morning panel. I'm interested in language and the language that's used and the term part-time. There's none of us work 24 hours a day, so we all work part-time, and the negative associations with that. And it's the UNICEF submission, if I can come to you, Mr. Ning, and the list, which others have produced as well, of all the grounds on which an employer could refuse. To what extent, if any, have these grounds been challenged legally?
I'm trying to remember actually that there's not an awful lot of case law on that, and I think certainly before the Equality Act, the case law was based on under the Sex Discrimination Act, on the grounds that because it was largely women that would ask for flexible working, and because certainly the European Court and the courts in this country recognise that women still undertake the majority of childcare responsibility, then, but it was not easy. You know, I mean, there's one or two cases that that held up, but it's a very difficult process, you know, for anybody to go to court in the first place. You know, and certainly it's not something that we would actively encourage. So that's why, through trying to do it through negotiation, that, you know, we would encourage employers. And I mean, the reality is that I don't know how many reports are out there by the Work Foundation, the, you know, small business employers that have actually made a very coherent case as to why flexible working actually works. And I think Emma's example of talking about the enormous reduction in sickness absence, you know, which costs lots of organisations and companies and businesses a huge amount of money. But we still struggle to get, you know, people knee-jerk and say, well, it's not going to work, you know, without actually looking at the longer-term picture.
I would agree resolution's better than any proceedings. The key to that might be having evidence. And can I ask the panel about data? Because that's mentioned in a few of the submissions there, and the dearth of data. I mean, for instance, yourself, Mr McGregor, you talk about, I think you said about 95%. Would you retain reasons centrally within the council as to why the requests had been turned down?
We monitor applications for flexible working, and I really was referring, I think it was 90%. We look at the figures over the last 5 years, but I would agree with Eileen. I think about requests for flexible working, I mean, the law is as such that if an employer wants to avoid it, you know, it's more a procedural basis. It's not, you know, the challenging of it. If they want to hide behind it and deny it, then they've got, you know, they have that ability to do that. So it's about whether you genuinely want to encourage and foster flexible working. And I think for us, even in more challenging financial times, it's key to engaging our workforce and you know, about high performance. So we see, as well as sickness absence, there are just huge benefits to flexible working and having that balance between individual employee needs and the service needs. So I think it's actually, it's more important actually when finances are tight and we have less people, that we have solutions that suit people's lives.
One specific, before the other panel members mentioned, there's some very compelling figures in relation to the corporate management team, and indeed the extended corporate management team there, albeit relatively small numbers. How many of them currently work on a flexible or part-time basis, or prior to their elevated positions did?
I don't think any of the senior management team work on a part-time basis, but all of them, or certainly most of them, do some form of home working at various days of the week. I think that's our chief executive does that. You know, they make I'll lead an example of that to make sure that they're out of the office sometimes, because I think presenteeism is something that we're actively trying to shift away from, because I don't think it actually helps us organisationally if people see the most senior leaders in the organisation there at fixed hours, long hours. It's about that shifting to outcomes and success rather than just people being to their desks. So my own director, the finance director, she's very often working from home, and I think people see that in the organisation.
Look at the data aspect of it.
We at Close the Gap are quite excited about the specific duties of the public sector equality duty, which will require public authorities to publish a whole range of employment data at the end of this month. And along with colleagues from across the equality sector and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, we'll be looking at the publication of that, because one of the things we hope and expect employers to publish is information about part-time and other forms of flexible working. So I think we'll have a clearer picture of what data there is once that publication has happened. Obviously, within the private sector, there is no requirement for them to publish any information whatsoever. So anything we know is entirely at the choice of private sector companies, and that often pops up in things like that annual equality report, if they produce such a thing.
I recently asked a question about the conditions that would be applied to a parliamentary question, those who would benefit from public sector contracts. Is it correct that the public sector should make these demands on people if they're not entirely doing it right themselves? Get your own house in order first, perhaps?
I have no comment on that, except to say that, of course, the requirements of the public sector duty are that public authorities must consider the need to include such a clause in a contract with the private sector when they're tendering for services. What that means, of course, is very unlikely to be that private sector companies will need to publish that data. I can't imagine a circumstance where that would be one of the requirements in a contract.
Thank you very much, Camilla.
Yes, just following on from something that was mentioned there, do we have is it a problem that we still have gender roles that say the woman will be the carer and the man won't be, and that the woman will just have to work around that? Is that fundamentally still the problem, and should we take our eyes off that?
I mean, I think I said in our submission that flexible working in a really good modern society has to be there for everybody, whether they work part-time. And when we talk about part-time, we're talking in terms of how employment legislation defines what part-time work is and how the courts actually define what that is. So you would be actively encouraging men to take up that option as well, not just in terms of the role that they play with their children and the upkeep and the contribution that they make to that child's life or other members of their family. And it's about how they get that balance of being happy and productive in the work that they do, but also the quality of life that they have when they're outside the work. And there is absolutely no doubt that good flexible working policies, however people want to work that, are absolutely invaluable in achieving that. If, however, we are to get away from the idea that flexible working is purely as a substitute for childcare, then it should never ever be seen that way. Now, our line in Unison and the line that the STUC and the ACC Women's Committee have all but consistently taken on this is you have to start looking at state-funded childcare with an investment in the workforce as well. And that's our position.
Other witnesses have a view on the gender roles?
Ask you to clarify the question.
Well,
is it a problem that women shoulder the brunt of domestic caring responsibilities in this country?
In all the talking about flexible working and part-time working and childcare, are we getting away from the core problem, which is that there's one set of expectations put on women and one set of expectations put on men?
So it's sort of a smoke screen of getting away from the core issues, which is, I mean, just to reiterate the point I made earlier, I fully agree with that. Yes, it is a problem. And flexible working, the debate around it cannot be understood in isolation of all, as Eileen just said. I mean, the childcare, the reasons why women are working and applying for flexible working in the first place, and fundamentally that we do not value women's work, unpaid or paid.
I think the issues around women in work are a wicked problem in that we can't exactly work out what the causes are. We don't know if we change one bit of the system, what the impact on other bits of the system will be, and it's all interrelated with other things. I entirely agree that the root cause is this assumption that women will do domestic and reproductive labour and men will go out into the formal labour market and do, as Jill called it, real work, so-called. But I suppose, what do we do with the knowledge that it is fundamentally about gender role stereotyping and assumptions about women and men? And I think we cannot therefore decide to do nothing as policymakers and employers and other citizens of Scotland. And so I suppose we come back to when we talk to employers, what is in scope for employers to do, and what can they do? Can they offer unintended bias training to their staff so that managers are not making decisions about work patterns based on assumptions about what women and men should be doing? Can there be systems put in place and arrangements made so that the real life experiences of the staff are reflected in some of those decisions? And I think we are where we are at the moment. Ideally, we would not want women to be taking the majority responsibility for childcare necessarily, although obviously that is for families to decide. We'd want men to be enabled to take up some of these flexible working arrangements, and frequently there's a cultural assumption that men won't want to do part-time working or flexible working, and that they're quite strange for asking for that. So we want it to sweep away some of those barriers, but at the moment we have to deal with the reality that right now women have the majority responsibility for care, and so that if we don't as employers take forward some action to acknowledge that in our own practices, then we'll be kind of waiting for a revolution that may never come.
I think anecdotally, I have represented men who have asked for a flexible working pattern because of childcare issues predominantly. And I recall one situation where his wife had the more senior role, both worked in an NHS, and it was quite an incredulous approach from the male's manager to say, well, what's his wife doing about this? You know, why is it him who's asking for this flexible working? And so there was this huge assumption that it should be she who had the more senior role and the higher salary that should be looking for the flexible working rather than him. And all of the barriers that could be put in that particular gentleman's case were, and it was quite a hard task to get them to think around. And I absolutely agree that it shouldn't be a substitute for childcare, but we also have to recognise that quite a lot of people want to look after their own children for part of the time. So I would like to think that was in a minority, but it's still out there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, do you mind if I come back in? It was just coming back to your point about is it a smokescreen for the fundamental systemic issues? And I think one way to begin addressing that is to make the links explicit. So in our submission, we put forward a recommendation that a strategy to address flexible working should be explored and developed through a gender lens and a gendered perspective, because gender blind and gender neutral language a lot of the time sweeps institutional sort of sexism and these cultural assumptions under the carpet, and then we don't really know what we're talking about anymore. Whereas flexible working is a gender issue, and so let's name it as that and make those sort of vertical links.
Supplementary.
Thank you very much. Do you think the legislation that's coming in for parental leave would afford the opportunity to shift some of the stereotypical culture that we have? Sort of shift the gender balance slightly? And because, I mean, obviously, you know, it probably does, to some extent, extend the in terms of unpaid leave for parental leave up to the age of 18. But do you think that affords an opportunity?
Who would like to pick up that first?
I think there's been difficulties in granting parental leave for the same reasons it's difficult to grant flexible working. All of the issues that are put forward about flexible working are put forward about parental leave. The needs of the service must come first. The provision of care, and all of these issues are put forward. So it's difficult because I know that some areas within NHS boards have implemented it fully and others just haven't, and it is proving quite difficult to get a shift on that.
No view as to whether or not that's going to afford the opportunity for more sort of men to sort of take the care role?
I think that remains to be seen, to be honest.
I think the changes to maternity leave, whereby it can be shared between parents, whether that's a man and a woman or obviously within a same-sex couple, can be quite helpful. And the learning from the rest of Europe, I suppose, and particularly the Scandinavian countries, is that it's been very hard for men to take up paternity leave or their share of the leave that you take immediately after the birth of a child. not just the 2 weeks, but a kind of longer commitment, because of the cultural assumptions, even in Scandinavian workplaces, that women will be doing primary care of young children. And in Sweden, they introduced what they called the daddy months, which were use it or lose it 2 months paternity leave that only men could use, that if the father didn't use it, then the whole family would lose that particular piece of paid leave. And even the take-up of that was still at a much lower level than was anticipated. So I think the cultural presumptions against men being involved in the care of very young children are really quite rigid. But I think it's extremely welcome that the government has introduced an arrangement whereby some part of that early care can be shared, and so therefore hopefully leading to a sense that it won't always be mummy that's called at work to come and deal with sick children or issues at school or anything else that crops up in the life of young children with a regularity, but that fathers will also feel skilled, empowered, and like they have a place in doing that.
Other questions, Dennis?
No, that's fine, thank you.
I was quite interested when Eileen Dinning, when you were talking about the definition of flexible working, because the definition that you gave of flexible working is very much the definition that I would understand flexible working to be. It should be a real and meaningful career choice, not a substitute for something else. So I suspect that all of the panel would agree that the issue we need to solve is the childcare issue. If we solve that, the issue of part-time and flexible working would automatically resolve itself. Perhaps not completely, but the childcare is the issue that we need to solve. Would you agree?
So, absolutely crucial. I mean, I know it's not necessarily the remit for this committee. Maybe it's the Education Committee. And I know that previous administrations have addressed the issue about childcare. But our view is that unless you go down the whole hog of state-funded, you know, I mean, if people still want to send their children, you know, within the private sector, that's fine. But they need the same protection and the same kind of advantages that they currently get in terms of primary and secondary education. And I don't see why that's any different. There's all sorts of benefits that come from it. All the research has been done. You know, whether it's the issue about wraparound care, as you would get in, you know, in a number of institutions, educational institutions throughout Scotland. But yes, I mean, that is certainly our view.
Can I just bring in Dennis and then John Mason before I bring in Emma?
Just, I'm interested that obviously childcare is obviously a significant factor, but is it not care in the round? Because a lot of people, I think a significant number of people actually, will look at perhaps looking at either part-time or flexible working because of maybe care of older, maybe relatives, for instance. So it's not just childcare. I would think it's not care in the round.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that, but I think you'll probably find, although you're probably right, Mr Robertson, in the sense that probably that figure will increase as we, and Lynn can probably back me up on this, if we've got an increasingly ageing population, we will see more and more people, you know, having to get involved in that level of care. But that then goes back to say, that's about looking at the entire care system within Scottish society, not just about childcare, about the care of the elderly, care of people with special needs, because that's another aspect as well of, you know, people that have got relatives with special needs disabilities, and that's a very, very specific challenge for many people.
Do you want to come in on that?
Yes, well, you'd mentioned childcare, and I was intrigued in Unison's paper. One of the phrases they said talks about long-standing Unison policy, could pay for itself through the increased tax income from more mothers working. I was just thinking, a mother would have to be on a very high salary to pay enough tax that would actually pay for the childcare, or am I misunderstanding that?
Why would they have to pay?
Well, I was thinking, I mean, if somebody was, say somebody got a job at 15,000, they'd be paying tax on about 5,000 of that,
Yeah,
which would be about 1,000.
A fair and transparent and progressive taxation system.
Yes.
So, you know, every time, you know, if women drop out of the employment market, then the government loses out in receiving income tax receipts, right? Irrespective of what they are paid. So it's about how you then work out a policy that ensures, because at the moment, I mean, we know that there are women that are paying more for private childcare than they're paying in mortgage payments. I mean, that just simply cannot be right. You know, so I think it's about, you know, political parties having the courage to actually bite the bullet and say, well, actually, we will have to raise income tax, but here's what you'll get in return. Right. And I don't think that's such a, you know, a bad option to put to people.
No, I mean, I think that's clarified it for me, because I was trying to work out how these figures were going to add up. But if you're saying that's right, if we increased income tax, for example,
figures.
No, I'm not going to get into any more detail. But if it's if it's increasing tax, then obviously there would be more money, and therefore we could put it in childcare. Absolutely, yes. I'm comfortable with that.
It's about how we revisit the taxation system.
The whole thing, right.
In this country.
Okay, I understand that now better. Thank you.
Emma, did you want to come in on that issue?
Yeah, not to explain Eileen's figures for her at all, but I think also that often when families are working out whether or not a woman should return to work, they make the kind of same calculation that you've just been talking about, Mr. Mason, in that they offset the cost of childcare against the wage that will be coming into the household. Of course, most people don't forecast their family economy much into the future, but the long-term scarring effect for women of taking time out of the labour market is immense. Even after 15 years, 1 year of part-time working is still showing up as a 10% reduction in the wage that compared to a man who has taken the same part-time working arrangement, usually to develop his human capital by undergoing some piece of education or training. So it's really a long-term impact, and I can see that actually if women return to the labour market, then the tax take could be significant in terms of their long-term earnings potential. The point I was going to make was about Finland, and Close the Gap was involved in a piece of transnational work with Finland where they do have a kind of universal provision of childcare, and they were quite struck when we were comparing data about different labour markets to note that there is such a lot of part-time working in Scotland. In Finland, part-time working is only done by students and people who are retiring from the labour market and are reducing their hours consequently to ease that transition. And they were really quite astonished that women in the middle of their careers would work part-time because, of course, with their childcare provision, that isn't a necessity at all. And in the context of European policy, part-time work is often seen as a bit of a failure, that economies aren't able to get women working full-time because they're not providing the other services, including care, sometimes changes to transport and other things that would enable that participation in the labour market. So I would echo Eileen and other colleagues' points on that.
Back in briefly. I mean, I appreciate that, and I think you're probably preaching to the converted when you say that in the long term we all see the benefit. I think what some of us are struggling with is where does the money come in the short term?
Absolutely. And Finland took the decision after the war, World War II, not to have an NHS, and so they put the money into childcare instead. They needed pronatal policies to get the number of citizens up after losses during the war. So they took a very deliberate policy decision to increase the rate of birth, and that's what they did. But you make a good point about how to invest in that and the hard decisions that have to be made.
Alice Johnson.
I'm just going to follow on from that. Interested in the international exemplars that have been given, and there's some interesting graphs there on part-time labour in the submission from Close the Gap. And the one that sort of jumps out or the country that jumps out as having a high proportion of part-time workers is the Netherlands. Is there any examples we can draw from that? You know, are they doing something different? Are they doing something more positive with part-time work in there?
The Netherlands have a system whereby until your child is really quite old, you can work on a 4-day-a-week basis. And so what couples frequently do is both work 4 days and then access childcare during the rest of the time. They also have quite an unfortunate system from the perspective of working parents of having a really long lunch break in the middle of the day in schools, in which you have to go and collect your child and then take them back after 2 hours have passed. And And actually, nursery provision has not met that gap. So that does place an enormous pressure on their whole childcare system. So I think we'd be cautious in learning some of the lessons from the Netherlands around that. But
something that there may be something to learn there,
absolutely.
But basically it's the peculiarities in that particular country.
That is quite a quirky system they have going. But I think the access, the guaranteed access to 4-day-a-week working, whether that's on a compressed hours basis or not, I think is very highly esteemed by working parents in the Netherlands. So that might come back to other colleagues' points about slight amendments to the law that would enable access to flexible working of a type.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? Can I just ask the panel, much has been done over the years to tackle the very thorny issue of equal pay in the public sector. And a huge amount of progress has been made. But the wider issue of the pay gap between women and men is still there. And there is a huge pay gap across the sectors between women and men. And I would be interested in your opinion on the rise in flexible working, the rise in part-time working, the lack of promotion prospects for women that work flexibly and part-time. Where do you see the pay gap going?
Shall I take that one?
Yes, please.
The part-time pay gap has been stagnant since the introduction of the minimum wage, which was the last thing that had a real impact on it, and it's still sitting at around 34%, which is quite astounding. And that is almost entirely explained by the fact that part-time work tends to be low paid and low status from the perspective of employers and the wider world, perhaps, occupations. The full-time pay gap has been nudging down ever so slightly and is now sitting at 12%. 11 years ago, it was at 20% in Scotland, but we've had a slight change to the calculation, so it's good news, but not quite as good news as that figure would suggest. And I think you're absolutely right, Convener, in identifying that we still have so many of the same situations persisting across the labour market and contributing to that figure. We're also likely to see a few shocks to that figure because of what is happening in the wider Scottish economy at the moment, and potentially with labour shedding in the public sector as a result of the pressures on budgets. I think I was quite struck by the figures in our submission when I was pulling them together about the fact that the number of women working, the proportion of women working part-time has not really changed. And neither has the part-time pay gap, which to me suggests that despite the fact that there are a number of employers doing very good work, that this hasn't spread across the labour market sufficiently to suggest that either there's been an increase in quality part-time work, and we're not seeing that, and we're also not seeing sufficient flexibility to enable more women to work part-time than did 10 years ago. So we're seeing those figures really staying the same. And so I think we will very much welcome the scrutiny of the committee on this, and also the Scottish Government's Women and Employment Summit and all the work other colleagues are doing to try and shine a light on the fact that things have changed to some degree, but we're not seeing the impact of those changes that we would hope.
Does anyone else want to Eileen?
The only thing I want to add to what Emma's got to say is that, I mean, we obviously welcomed the Scottish Government's decision to introduce the amended specific duties to the public sector duty. And we're now starting to see that public authorities are producing equal pay statements in line with those duties. What we would really like to see, and I think it would certainly be able to follow the progress or otherwise of what Emma was just talking about there, is that if the government, if the Scottish Government was to think about amending that legislation in order to bring in equal pay audits, because unless you do the audit, you know, you can have a statement and you can say, yeah, we're really committed to equal pay and, you know, we'll ensure that, you know, we work towards that. But unless you actually have a proper audit, an equal pay audit, then you're not going to be able to monitor those changes. And, you know, it's a big piece of work initially. It's not difficult to do, but it's a big piece of work initially, depending on the size of the organisation. I think Gavin would back me up on that. But once you've got that system in place, then you can start to monitor. And you can address very quickly where potential problems may come up in the future. How would you resolve them? Because the last thing that we want is to see any more litigation at employment tribunals. It has cost the public purse millions of pounds. So if in the long term we want to save those millions, put them into childcare maybe, you know, do something useful with it. But, you know, get the audit in place. Get that as part of the specific duties.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
I think the issue within NHS boards since the implementation of Agenda for Change has almost negated equal pay claims, but if there was any meddling to be done with the Agenda for Change, it would almost definitely impact on equal pay claims because of the predominantly high proportion of women within the Agenda for Change pay scales.
Siobhan McMahon has a supplementary and then John Mason has one as well. Siobhan.
It's on the RCN submission again, and you've touched on the Agenda for Change there, but you also spoke about the pay freeze, the 2-year pay freeze, and what that's bringing. I mean, you spoke about, which actually was a start figure, that the majority of staff are experiencing a 9% cut in the living standards over these 2 years. What barrier does that bring to the profession to retain the workforce, as you said, as they're getting older, to introduce people to the workforce and to bring in males to the workforce as well, because clearly that's something that we'd want to see as we get more equal?
It's something that we see as a constant battle because of, if you look at the average age of a student nurse, you would assume a student nurse is 18, 19 years old. The average age of a student nurse is late 20s, early 30s, and to try and get people into the profession, as I say, we are a ageing workforce, and unless we get people in, and it is a huge barrier to overcome because of the pay freeze and also the incremental freeze for a number of people as well has prevented people. We have a vacancy, we have a shortage in a number of areas, and there is no incentives for people to actually go after some of the even promoted posts because of the loss of unsocial hours and weekend rates, which people rely on because of the pay freeze. So it is a huge barrier to a number of areas in increasing recruitment.
And just on, again, the pay gap in gender, again, used quite stark language when they called the Scottish Government's approach paying plentiful lip service to the need for faster progress on the pay gap. Could you expand on that as to why you think that's the case and what you would like to see from the Scottish Government?
I think that there's a small typo in the way that was typed up in the and what I was referring to is actually a couple of other strategy policy documents. For instance, the Child Poverty Strategy, which says the Scottish Government is addressing the pay gap and occupational segregation. And so that was the lip service I was referring to, and sort of in speeches and so on, whereby it's heralded as something that a lot's been done on, when in fact the figures speak for themselves.
See a more practical approach to it rather than.
I'd like to see it substantiated with, rather than just a reference to the tackling the pay gap in strategy documents elsewhere. I'd like to see more specifics on that, and that's where Engender tries to play a role in joining up the sort of disparate policy agendas and looking at it systemically, so that it's not so that there's policy coherence across the piece.
One of the things that you've suggested for the committee to look at in inquiry is for the equal investment across modern apprenticeships, which is something that I've spoke about as an inquiry has progressed. So do you think that, again, that's the barrier to the occupational segregation, that in one of the approaches that the government could take forward to make sure that those starting out in modern apprenticeships and to retain them get equal investment?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's part of, as we spoke about earlier, a cross-cutting strategy on occupational segregation, modern apprenticeships being part of that, but also looking at tools within the educational system, careers advice, and the sort of the multi-stakeholder action plan that Close the Gaps recommended as well.
John Mason and then Dennis Robertson.
Convener, it was following your mention of equal pay claims and so on. It was to get some idea as to where we are with the historical ones and if we are actually catching up. Because I saw, if it was the RCN, you said 10,000 live equal pay claims, and I'm assuming some of them maybe go back sometime. Do they?
Go back a number of years.
Yes. Are we anywhere near getting resolution to these?
It's been a very, very long process, and I unfortunately don't have the figures of how many still are in that process. A number of them were withdrawn laterally, but I wouldn't know how many of them are live just now. I can certainly get that information for you.
As a whole, it's still just a kind of step-by-step battle. There's no big kind of breakthrough
It is.
happening.
Yes, there's no breakthrough.
Is that generally true with local authorities as well? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very much case law driven, and there's it's variance across different local authorities, their experience on it. So a lot of them are settled based on case law. So I think for our position, we're certainly hopefully near the end of it.
I mean, is it the position that some local authorities just could not afford to meet all the claims that are being made?
Not that I'm aware of. I think most of them have provision for the liabilities for equal pay, and as I say, the settlements are based on a position across various councils of case law, and sometimes there's a ripple effect when there's a particular piece of case law that impacts on these, and then there's a round of settlement, so it does seem to be a long, drawn-out process.
Thank you, Convener. Do you think that women themselves have a role to play in trying to move away from some of this gender stereotype opportunities for employment and getting into areas that are generally not deemed to be those that you would see maybe women in, for instance in engineering, oil and gas, construction, because there's vast opportunities, and we have an opportunity because there's such a shortage of skills in those sectors. Why do you think women aren't really taking those opportunities up?
Because I think the first thing is that it would do the committee no harm to actually talk to a very specialist group of women, and that's the Science, Engineering and Technology network that was set up to promote the cause of women within those particular sectors. But the reality is that if you don't deal with the first two issues that we spoke about this morning, that's the issue about how we address childcare, because women still give birth to children unless it becomes biologically impossible in the future or there's a change. That is the reality. And unless you change that, unless you deal with the whole issue in flexible working, and that means how we understand flexible working to be in childcare, and particularly where you're asking women to go into traditionally male-dominated industries, where there maybe might not be the kind of sympathy or empathy. Empathy, I think, is probably the word I'm looking for here, and flexibility that you might find in other areas of work. And I was thinking about that when I was driving through this morning, thinking, well, you're never going to solve the issue about occupational segregation until you get the other stuff right first.
I think any woman who does end up working in a non-traditional male-dominated occupation has been swimming against the tide for her entire life, and that would need to have started in primary school, and then certainly by the time she selects her subjects in secondary school and thereafter. And I think that is a very difficult thing to do, and there's not a lot of formal encouragement of that. There are programmes, and Eileen mentioned the Scottish Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology, who do great work and work with female university students working and studying in non-traditional areas. But there hasn't been, until the Scottish Government's announcement of the CareerWise programme, a concerted push across the public provision in schools to try and encourage some of that. And I would also point to Jill's point about the Modern Apprenticeship Programme. The access point to some of those occupations is by and large through the Modern Apprenticeship Programme, and we still see incredible patterns of segregation within that. I think 1% of the construction apprentices are female, and so if that is the portal in which you enter the construction industry, then that door is pretty much at the moment closed to girls for a variety of reasons. So I think we can do more to build up girls' own resilience to the idea of studying and then working in a male-dominated environment. But I think there's also things that other actors in the whole process can do to try and shift some of those figures. Everywhere I go, there's someone from the engineering sector saying, no one understands engineering, it's not all being covered in oil from head to foot every day. It actually involves, you know, being in an office and using computers quite a lot. So I think the sector itself recognises that it has a different story to tell. I'm not for a second suggesting girls do not enjoy being covered in oil every day, but I think the engineering sector itself recognises it has a bit of a sales pitch to offer. So yes, I think more needs to be done.
Do the panel of witnesses have any further comments on that subject?
Just briefly to build on what Emma said, and I think your question was, should there be an onus on women, or do women have some sense of responsibility in putting themselves forward for these jobs? And I think we can't lose sight of the fact that those choices that women make take place within these existing structures where they don't really have a real choice, the sexist structures of discrimination that they face. And Emma, you made reference to women swimming against the tide from primary school, and I'd go a step further and say that they're swimming against the tide, you know, right from the start. And it's all, you know all these things, but gender, toys that people play with, and what they're given and what they're told, and that's all part of the cultural assumptions that then feed into occupational segregation right the way through.
Do any of the committee members have any further questions for our witnesses this morning? In that case, can I thank our panel of witnesses for coming along this morning and giving us your evidence that will help as we continue our scrutiny of women in work. And that concludes today's meeting, and our next meeting will take place on Thursday the 2nd of May and will include further oral evidence on women in work. Thank you.